Well, we have some people joining us now from the waiting room. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on Drinking with Historians. And we are really delighted to be welcoming Jamelle Bouie with us today. And we'll get to some questions in a minute. But the first question I think I have to ask you, Jamelle, that we ask everybody is, what are you drinking tonight?
I'm drinking a glass of wine. My wife bought it. I think it's a Cabernet. I don't know anything more than that about this particular bottle of wine. I just poured myself a glass real quick. So that's what I'm drinking. A glass of wine. We don't really, I'm not a big beer person, and I've fallen out of drinking liquor. And so we're just like a wine family now.
You're a wine guy.
So. Yeah, I'm a wine guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about you, Matt?
So I have some whiskey today. I was actually having the exact opposite conversation with my wife today. It's like, because she drinks wine, and then we have a number of friends who drink beer, and I used to only drink wine and beer, and I've just kind of stopped, and I don't really know why. And now it seems weird when I do that, and so I just have a little bit of whiskey every once in a while. So the whiskey I'm drinking is something called Mixed Blood by Du Nord Distillery, which is a Black-owned distillery in Minneapolis. And I found out about them because during the George Floyd uprising, they were hit very hard by the protests, and the place was burned down. And so they were selling actually during the pandemic across the United States. And so I got this, and then afterwards I drank the bottle very quickly. And then David Perry, my co-author and friend, fortunately illegally, I guess, so I shouldn't be admitting this on Zoom, sent me a bottle of whiskey. So
technically, it's only illegal if you mail it to West Virginia. Apparently, that's the only real state where you can't mail liquor to. It's just West Virginia. I mean, there might be a couple other states, but yeah,
we can't order it in Virginia. Across state lines. So that's kind of the issue. But I think as a gift, I think it's probably fine.
Yeah,
so I wasn't paying anybody for it. So anyway, what about you, Varsha?
I'm having a Whistle Pig 12-year rye, just because I was in the mood for something not Scotch, even though I love Scotch. And so this is one of the sweeter ryes that I've ever had. Usually rye is really spicy, but this is a really sweet one. It's if you smell it, smells like candy. It's a really good rye.
It's a good cocktail rye.
Yeah.
Precisely because of the sweetness. It's a good cocktail rye.
Yep.
Yes. I mean, Varsha, do you, you are such a snob about this, and I think you'll admit a snob, right? About your whiskeys. But do you make cocktails, or do you drink cocktails, or is it mostly just straight whiskey, right?
Just me. Yeah. Literally yesterday, I'm taking Korean for fun. And so I had a speaking test, and it was over Zoom, and the teacher, she gets on the Zoom and she's like, "Oh my God, there's so much, liquor behind you. Is that all yours?" And I was like, "Yeah, that's all mine." She's like, "So you only drink whiskey? Do you mix it with juice?" Which is the Korean word is just juice. And I was like, "No, I just drink it neat." She's like, "No ice?" I was like, "No ice." And yeah, it's really funny because there's been this I think depending on the type of people you talk to, usually when somebody says they like whiskey, you picture a middle-aged white guy, from maybe from the South or maybe somewhere in the United States, and he's very
you just mean me, Varsha. You just
no, but I don't mean you because you.
No, it's fine.
Put ice in your whiskey and you make cocktails with it. But usually when they picture somebody who walks into a bar with a spreadsheet, they don't picture me, and so it's. I'm just saying the struggle is real, but yeah, no, I don't make cocktails. I think the only time I've made cocktails is when I was teaching myself to drink whiskey. I would drink Jameson and Coke. I hated Jack Daniels. I had a trauma with Jack Daniels. I was like, never again. And then sometimes I would make equal parts apple cider, ginger beer, and bourbon, which is a great Kentucky mule.
Yeah, I mean, very refreshing on a hot summer day. So anyway, we should probably talk about other things other than whiskey, though.
Yeah.
To move on. So thank you again, Jamelle, for joining us. One of the things I think when we were thinking about kind of who we wanted to host on the show, I mean, your name has come up many times, and so I'm really glad you were able to join us. But one of the things that's so interesting about your work, especially your columns now for the New York Times, is how you weave history into as an explanatory metric for how to think about contemporary events. Has this always been the case? Is this something that you've kind of discovered kind of as you've kind of gone along in your career, or where does this interest in history come from? I guess.
those are two distinct questions. The
Sure.
interest in history, I've always been interested in history going back to when I was a kid. I'm from Virginia Beach, Virginia, which is sort of in the southeastern corner of the state, for those of you who don't know your Commonwealth geography. And it's pretty in close proximity to Williamsburg and Jamestown and lots of Revolutionary War era stuff. And then the short hop away from Civil War stuff. And so I think that if you just have any disposition towards older stuff as a child, and you're into history as a kid, even a little bit, being in that region of the country, it's just sort of like a very easy place to get really into it. And that's more or less what happened with me. We had a library open up by my house, like when I was in maybe middle school, and I spent a lot of time just checking out history books. I don't know. It's just a thing I've been interested in for a long time. But I didn't study history in college. I was in an interdisciplinary major called Political and Social Thought at the University of Virginia. And that was sort of a kind of a great booksy kind of thing, Western political heritage tradition, but it broadly conceived, not narrowly, sort of like the typical guys, but sort of like the Toni Morrison in there, some Du Bois, like a broad conception of what the Western political tradition consisted of. And then I did lots of political science, and so history is obviously going to be a part of that kind of course of study.
Sure. But
it's not necessary. It wasn't like I wasn't a history major. Was not reading a lot of history in college, but the interest has always been there. And so on my free time, I would read. And then once I got into journalism after college, I would continue to read stuff I was interested in. It was the sesquicentennial, whatever that word is, the 150th year anniversary of the Civil War from 1861, from 2011 to 2015. And so there's also just a lot of opportunity, just like read a lot about this period of history that I'm specifically interested in.
Yeah.
In terms of my work, it doesn't really start integrating itself into my work until relatively recently, when my last couple of years at Slate, and certainly when I started at the New York Times. And really, it's been since I've been at the New York Times, which at this point is about almost 4 years now. Maybe this is my 5th year there. It was at the Times, and with essentially the direction to sort of do whatever you want to do with the space, do what you want with the column, that really opened up for me kind of the opportunity to kind of experiment a bit and to bring this stuff in. And also, frankly, I have all this time to just read. I work from home. There's a big research library down the street from me at the university. So I just had this opportunity to maybe begin to integrate my interest in history with my work a little more. And also, the last thing I'll say on this is that a twice a week column is a difficult thing to do. Most people, and I can include myself in this, don't really have that many opinions. Like if you have that many opinions, most of them are bad, just straight up. Like most of them are bad.
If you have
trivial.
a take, it's a bad take.
Yeah. Right. I mean, really, seriously, like if you have a take, if you have an original take twice a week, and you can keep that up for more than like 3 months, at a certain point, you're just churning out bad takes. And so knowing that my job is to write twice a week at least, and write something interesting, I started to conceive that less in terms of what is my take, and more in terms of like, well, what can I provide? Like what resources, what knowledge, whatever, what can I provide to a reader to contextualize something, to deepen their understanding of something, to connect something happening in the present to something happening in the past, and explain why that connection is worth making, and whatever you can glean from that connection. And so conceiving of the job in terms of that, in terms of what can I provide, as a person who has both an interest in and access to lots of history, is what's helped me keep the job sustainable. Because I frankly don't have that many takes. I really don't.
Yeah. Well, one of the most common, I'm not saying I see it from you, but most common people who sort of use history to sort of talk about American politics today, the thing that's like very in or trendy right now in American history is to talk about Reconstruction and why it sort of failed. I would say this began even before the 1619 Project. And I recently went to a conference, and a lot of the presenters were talking about Reconstruction, but they're talking specifically about how the Freedmen's Bureau, right, has been sort of rehabilitated perhaps too much, because sort of linked the idea of free work, wage work, with actual freedom for free Blacks in the South. And I was just wondering if, in your work in the New York Times, if you've sort of like thought a lot about this relationship between capitalism and slavery, and if that's sort of like come up when you're thinking about, current racial politics today in the US, and how you sort
Yeah,
of
I
grapple
mean,
with that.
yeah, no, it certainly has. I mean, it's something I've been reading about and interested in for a while now. I've also observed how Reconstruction has become somewhat trendy recently, and part of me is like, well, I did this big podcast on it like 6 years ago. I've been kind of on the Reconstruction kick for a long time, and I'm glad to see it. I do think just as a like uses of history in journalism, I do think that there is a tendency to use history and as like a way to make like prescriptions or to make predictions. And I think that's like not good.
Nope.
Historians are terrible prophets.
I mean,
We're bad
Terrible
at it.
prophets. Yeah,
first of all, yeah, I mean, we all are. Everyone's a terrible
of course.
prophet.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that just like I don't think that's where the value lies. I think the value really lies in grappling with social forces and broad questions and challenges that people in the past faced, and just like seeing how they approached them, how they faced them, how they didn't face them. And sort of like there are things you can learn from taking that example seriously, but they're not going to tell you what to do next. They're just sort of like insights to have, observations to make. But on the slavery and capitalism thing, it's for me, it's been kind of interesting the last 5 years, in which I have had this interest in the history of slavery and in Reconstruction. And this, because I think trying to answer the question of like what was slavery and what was Reconstruction requires you to grapple with the fact that, well, slavery was a labor system first and foremost. Yeah. And the central questions, many of the central political questions around the Reconstruction regarded what is to be the status of Black labor in the South, that you kind of inevitably, if you're taking that stuff seriously, end up thinking about, well, what does the development of capitalism look like in the United States? And how does emancipation and its fallout end up sort of influencing and structuring the development of U.S. capitalism, North, South, and nationally. And then from there, you kind of just end up in kind of the classic territory. Well, like what is the relationship of capitalism to race and capitalism to racism? Like what, these two things, you want to call them systems, you want to call them structures, whatever, they develop, historically, they kind of develop together. They develop in tandem.
Sure.
And so what exactly is the relationship between them? And so that is something I do think about. I've occasionally written about it for the Times, not less so in column form, more so in like my more casual newsletter mode. And usually just to sort of suggest for Times readers that, broadly speaking, it might be better to not think about American race relations so much in terms of like personal prejudice or whatever, and much more in terms about, what purpose does this serve in terms of structuring American society? Like, what does it do versus what, I kind of at a certain point don't care about what's in people's hearts, but like, what does all this do? And how should that shape our understanding of our present, but also about what this country is?
Yeah, I think that's oftentimes I think historians, or I should say professional historians or academic historians, often fall into that trap as well, is caring too much about kind of individual motivation or like intentionality, and leaving aside kind of the implications or kind of the impact that people's actions actually do. I tend to think of that as kind of an oversubscription to kind of a Protestant kind of faith-based epic, or modern American Protestantism kind of a sense of, what matters in somebody's heart is kind of what matters, ultimately leaving aside kind of the impact of their actions. One of the things that was kind of related to that, though, is giving that important context, right, to something like, I don't know, like weird things that are going on at the Supreme Court of the United States, just to take an example, just kind of pulling that out of my head for no reason whatsoever. Does it, like, I think that's such an important kind of service, because people want to know, like, did Sam Alito really mean it, or did John Roberts, like, was he acting in this particular way? And then they get wrapped up in these particular, in these particular ways of understanding the past, in which it's all about kind of intentionality, when the reality of the fact that their spouses are taking so much money, and then or that there's these transactions happening, like really changes how we should think about the structure, kind of the function of the whole branch of government in some way.
Yeah. I just quick interruption. I think the most interesting thing about the Supreme Court story is that it's in tandem with this push towards originalism from the main, 6 justices on the court. And for the longest time, since the conservatives have been in control, there's been this, argument for originalism. But fundamentally, every time you read a new opinion based on that, it's just more and more proof that they, just really, really bad. They have bad archivists and they have bad historians on their team. And so I was just, based on the relatively new corruption story that came out today, not the original one, I was wondering, based on your work at the Times, how do you sort of deal with just sort of what Matt asked? How do you sort of deal with like the decrease in like credibility given to institutions like the Supreme Court? How do you like to talk about that? How do you use history to sort of talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, with regard to the Supreme Court, the approach I've taken is to really try to emphasize for readers that the current conception of the court, and current, I mean, really the past 2 generations. Like, I mean, really for it's been long enough that it feels like that's always been how the court has been, right? It's always been how the court's been perceived, but it's not. And part of what I'm trying to do is to emphasize that this is historically speaking, a somewhat recent development. But that conception is of the court, first of all, as the court as a sole arbiter of what the Constitution means, right? That like it is the only legitimate actor that can say what the Constitution means. That's the first thing. The second thing, the court as some sort of like vaguely progressive force in US society, that the court, Brown v. Board, Roe v. Wade, RIP, the court as this institution that is protecting the rights of various minorities, like securing equality in our political system, et cetera, et cetera. That's two. And the third thing is the court as being in some sense, if not apolitical, then kind of like floating outside the constitutional system, right? And so that it would be inappropriate, for example, for Congress to subpoena a chief justice, right? That would be an inappropriate thing to do. It would be a violation of separation of powers in some sense for Congress to do that, for the Senate to do that. And in my column, the thing when I write about the court, and I tend to write about it in this sort of more historical mode, is to say, well, all of that is a recent development, right? Prior basically to the middle of the 20th century, the court was like reliably reactionary. Like it wasn't a particularly progressive institution. And you can make a very good case that the things that we hold, the cases that we hold in esteem, like Brown v. Board, don't represent forward thinking as much as the court fixing its own mistakes, right? Like, the court guts the 14th Amendment in the 1880s, and then 70 years later, it's like, oh, sorry about that. That to me isn't an institution that is progressive in any sort. That the idea that the court is the only legitimate arbiter of what the Constitution means, it's very recent, right? Like in living memory, Americans did not think this way about the court. This has been a a gradual development that begins after the Second World War. And the court being somehow not bound by the same checks and balances of the other branches of government. Again, the 19th century is full of contestation over the power of the court and the extent to which Congress can sort of influence it. And I think it's useful to emphasize that the modern court is a very different thing, right up to its composition. I wrote a column last year, maybe, that got a few people were like, "What is this?" And it was me making this is a kind of a hobby horse of mine, making the case that there are too many lawyers in the court.
100% agree. I have a couple lawyer friends, they say the same thing.
But I mean, the historical case is that, like, up until the past kind of generation, there were politicians on the Supreme Court. There were, like, party hacks in the Supreme Court. Being an elite lawyer from, like, one of 3 law schools with one of, like, 2 previous jobs is not normally how this thing is operated. And so bringing all this up is, I think, useful, both just it's nice to know, but also when we're in a moment where the court is kind of mired in scandal, where there are these questions about, is the court too powerful? Does the court need to be restrained in some way? Part of what I'm trying to do is say, well, yes, it does. And also here is precedent for doing so. And here are potential resources you can use if you're going to make that your political project. And that's finding those resources is going to end up looking at the past, but also, like, looking at the structure of American government and asking yourself, well, theoretically, how is this all actually supposed to work? So yeah, I hope that answers your question. I think that's an answer.
Yeah, no, it definitely did, because I think a good example is this semester I'm teaching for the US foreign policy class, and the first thing my professor mentions to my students is the actual explanation of what the president and what the government should do in terms of foreign policy is very ill-defined in the Constitution. The article defining what the president should do, also ill-defined. There's no explanation of what the State Department should be doing, et cetera, et cetera. But it's the same thing for the Supreme Court. And it was also, like, one of the papers at the panel, the conference I went to, where they were talking about John Jay, and John Jay was basically improvising the whole thing. And it took a century of justices sort of improvising and figuring out how the system should work before anyone's actually taking them seriously. And I think that's, points to your most recent point about how history should be used as sort of a guideline as to understand how we got here, right? Not what we should do in the future, but if we understand how we got here, we can sort of better understand why we're in this position, not specifically what we should do next. And
it also shows, I mean, like, I think the thing about like history and the way that Jamelle, that you kind of talk about it, is it shows alternatives, right? Like, it didn't necessarily have to get to this place. There were choices that were made along the way that led us there, but we could have at any moment, made another choice, and we could have wound up in a very kind of different place. This kind of leads in, if it, we have a question, like, from a viewer who's asking about kind of, because it seems like in some ways, you specifically related to the Supreme Court, is that, the argument about kind of what the Supreme Court's power is, it's based on history, right? It's a claim to originalism. That's a claim towards history, but that in some ways is a very different type of claim, in which it's trying to draw a direct line from, like, now 2023 to 1789, or kind of something like that, right? And so how do you see kind of the counter arguments to, like, your columns? Like, are these bad faith, or are these just kind of differing understandings about kind of the meaning of the past?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think they're bad faith or anything. I do think that, right, there are good faith disagreements about how to understand the past. Where I have my questions, especially when it comes to originalism and the court and such, is an argument, for example, basically this is the way we've done things with regards to the court. The court's always been 9 members, so why should we change it? to like my response to that is always, well, there's, 9 is sort of an arbitrary number, right? Like there's no logic there. So if you're going to argue from tradition that it should be 9, I'm going to argue from just the basis, like, well, what are we actually trying to accomplish with the court? And are we better served by having more justices or fewer justices, right? On like originalism, I mean, I feel like my complaint about originalism is like everyone who has like any kind of like passing knowledge of like the 18th and 19th centuries complaint, which is like, what is the whole project seems insane. Like,
yeah, you put a Cool Ranch Dorito in front of Thomas Jefferson, he's gonna have no idea what to do with a Cool Ranch Dorito. Like you can't.
Right.
It's like
that
that
much
similar
flavor
argument.
would like kill the man, right? So like
Exactly.
If
now I know what I'm doing with the time machine. If I ever get one.
You're giving George Washington some
what a TikTok channel I would have. So anyway, sorry.
Some Takis.
Takis, yeah. Takis.
I'm trying to think of a snack, but I couldn't remember. No, but even if you're gonna like operate, if you're gonna take seriously the idea that somehow you can relate the constitutional thinking, the original public meaning, whatever, of the late 18th and the 19th century to the challenges faced by Americans in the present, then you also have to, my response to a lot of originalist arguments, like the one in Dobbs or the one in Bruin, is to say we have to take the full scope of the society at hand. You can't simply like narrowly focus on like one set of participants, one set of elites. You have to look at sort of like everything. You have to ask questions about like the entire society before you can come to any judgment. I'm a little skeptical of the project of progressive originalism, in part because I'm skeptical about the value of like arguing on those grounds with people who I think at the end of the day just care about getting what they want and not so much the argument. But I will say I did appreciate Judge Jackson's argument about the 14th Amendment with regards to sort of race consciousness and her kind of straightforwardly arguing, a very straightforward argument. Like this is not a fancy argument, but it's clear in the record that of course the architect of the 14th Amendment were thinking about race and were like race conscious. Like how could they not be? Like that was the whole point. And so it's a little crazy to say, oh, well, under the 14th Amendment, the government can't recognize race at all. And the people who wrote the thing wrote it specifically to recognize the effect of race in the society. I think in terms of public argumentation, right, like not so much trying to convince the court, but convince the public, I think that can be useful because the Constitution and the idea of originalism, I do think makes a lot of sense to the broader public. That's sort of the great political coup of originalism. It just sounds intuitive to people, like, oh yeah, we should try to do things according to how the people who wrote the thing what they meant. And someone like me arguing, well, what they thought doesn't really matter all that much. What matters is us. That strikes people as unreasonable, unfortunately. So like kind of there is a case for arguing on those grounds. But my approach is often just to sort of say, well, if we're gonna take this view, where we really have to take seriously the idea of trying to reconstruct what people in the society thought about the thing. And that's going to require you to do more than like look at dictionaries or read notes from like one set of elites.
Yeah.
We actually have sources.
Right. Yeah. No, there was actually one of my favorite ever TikToks is some people have the power to make 10-minute long TikToks. At that point, it's just a YouTube video. But this one person who I think is a historian or a legal scholar was like, my favorite document is the Reconstruction Amendment debates. And she's gone through all the debates of the Reconstruction Amendments. And they're full of, she's amazing. And they're full of people talking, the people at the time talking about exactly why race matters. And then I think my favorite thing is it leads into one of the questions that the audience asked, which was, how is Reconstruction different in the North and South? One thing I wanted to point out is, there were a lot of abolitionists, obviously, from the North, but a lot of these abolitionists are abolitionists because they're interested in free labor, not because they're interested in racial equality. And so, some of them, one of them being Harriet Beecher Stowe's, I think, brother or something, ends up going back on his word when it comes to giving African Americans, free enslaved people, their 40 acres. like he starts freaking out, and he basically, this is all in like South Carolina. And so I think one of the, the question that, adding on to Linda's question, is not only how was Reconstruction different in the North and South, but how do you sort of see, when you're writing your column, how do you sort of talk about anti-racism and like how it actually is manifested, and what are the limits to people who aren't oppressed and how they sort of deal with being anti-racist?
Yeah. So Reconstruction differences in North and South. I mean, sure, it's like when you're thinking about Reconstruction in the North, you're kind of thinking about Northern public opinion and sort of like the Northern perspective on actually what's happening in the South. And one useful way of thinking about this is that for Black Southerners themselves, or African Americans themselves, and for free Blacks in the North, kind of the question is like Black self-determination, right? Like how can the former slaves have political self-determination? How can they have economic self-determination? How can they both include themselves into the society and like build themselves up as sort of like full participants? And for much of the North, especially not the majority of people who are anti-slavery, but not necessarily, they weren't necessarily abolitionists. They may not necessarily care about the status of Black people, like any of that. Their concerns are if they're maybe, capital owners, industrialists, that sort of thing. They're like political elites. It's how can we get votes out of these people? How are they going to relate to a free labor system? Are they going to come north and compete for jobs in northern cities, or are we going to keep them in the South as sort of like a free labor agricultural workforce, essentially doing the kind of work they did under slavery, but not enslaved, working for wages? And then how are we going to reconcile the country itself? How are we actually going to like bring the country back together? On what basis are we going to do that? Is it going to be along a free labor, wage labor basis entirely, or are we going to make concessions to white elites in the South? And one way to look at the story of Reconstruction is basically Northerners starting off on we're really going to try to reintegrate the South on our terms, and ending on the important thing is just we reintegrate the South because we need the labor and we need the markets. And if they want to do their own thing, the white South, then we should just let them do their own thing. Like that's kind of the trajectory.
That's kind of the story of America is in some ways, right? Like fuck it, this is really hard.
Right.
It's really difficult. We're just going to let it go.
Yeah, it's just like, all right.
It's a similar story with school desegregation, right? Where like the federal government does get involved, and as well as like when it comes to Jim Crow and ending sort of Jim Crow, the federal government gets involved. But then when it becomes too difficult to actually dismantle certain aspects of de facto segregation, the federal government just puts its hands up and like leaves, which is why a lot of urban centers today in the U.S. are the most segregated in the country when it comes to schools, right? Even though segregation is technically illegal.
I should say
so
too, with Reconstruction, it's also important to note that like in 1873, there's a massive economic collapse that affects the entire the US, Europe. It's like a huge deal. And one thing I do think it's important to note is that like these things are recurring and they tend to line up with like titanic events in US history. And so I think it's useful to, there's a failure of Northern will, you could say. It's also the Panic of 1873 wipes out the Republican Party in Congress. It kind of it plunges the country into economic turmoil. It makes people much more hidebound, much less willing to take risk. All the things that come with big economic downturns, and that too is part of the story of the end of Reconstruction in the South and the North. The sort of the differing responses to a major economic downturn. You asked a question about anti-racism, and it's funny. I don't really write about that at all these days. Like I haven't for some time. I don't know. I just don't find it fruitful that much these days. But I'll say that my kind of echoing something I said earlier. My interest is far more in sort of how do we build a more egalitarian society free of various perceived hierarchies? One very consequential one of which is race, but it's not exclusively the only thing that structures US society. And so when like the subject of anti-racism comes up, I'm often sort of the person saying simultaneously, it's very important to realize that like race hierarchy exists in the country, that it's like a material thing. It's not simply in people's heads. It's like it has a real impact on people's lives. But that if you were to eliminate all racial distinctions as well, there would still be horrible class inequality, right? And so like you got to think about that too. Like that's the story too.
Yeah.
And trying to disentangle or disaggregate those two things, I think will like lead you astray more often than not.
Yeah. Is there really, I mean, like one of the wonderful things I think about your column, and I think like when history is done well, regardless of kind of who's doing it, right? Like whether it's in a classroom or in a column or just, you know, in a book or something like that, is that it shows the complexity of these things, is because like you were talking about kind of the 1873 kind of panic, right? Like that's often left out oftentimes of kind of the general conception, the general understanding of how you know, Reconstruction moves, right? Is that economic factors need to be taken alongside kind of political, cultural, and social factors as well. Like simple explanations are oftentimes like very seductive, but they're deeply problematic because they're oftentimes trying to sell a particular understanding of, you know, why X or Y kind of happened.
The other thing, just so I can add to that, I mean, the other thing, and like Rick, I think this 1873 example is a good one because monocausal explanations of things, I think, have a tendency of erasing contingency out of the picture, right?
Yes, that was the next word I was going to mention. I was going to mention contingency. Yeah.
Like if your view, and this is a thing that's very common, and it drives me a little crazy. But if your view is like, yeah, Reconstruction failed because of Southern racism and Northern racism and like Jim Crow, you know, 1877, they have Jim Crow. It's like, well, there's a lot that causes the failure or the end or the destruction of however we're going to put it of Reconstruction that isn't simply racial prejudice. And in fact, those other factors help us understand why it is that the Republican Party, for example, which just a few years prior had this strong commitment to Black civil rights, why people in the Republican Party made different choices in the 1880s. Like you have to be able to explain why are people making different choices. And simply saying, "Oh, well, they're all racist," or it's not enough. It's not enough. It doesn't do the work for you. And in fact, there's a degree in which like you're kind of just assuming a certain you're assuming the conclusion. You're assuming there's a thing that needs to be explained that you're just using as the explanation.
Yeah. I think one of the things, you know, when you started talking about contingency and you brought up 1873, one of the things that totally changed my experience of history and understanding of how to be a historian was my first semester of grad school. We were talking about, I was in a class about the Constitution, its critics, its aims, and its, you know, legacies. And we ended up reading a book by Pauline Maier called Ratification, which is goes to the amazing book. It's a beautiful book. And we also read The Framers' Coup. And I just, that whole semester, I went into that semester really excited for my first ever AHA, which was in DC. It was my first time in DC. I remember going up to my professor being like, I get to see the Constitution in person. And our professor, won't name names, was like, it's just a piece of paper. And I was like, whoa. And by the end of that semester, like 2 weeks after the end of the semester, I have to go to DC. I'm not even that interested in seeing the piece of paper anymore because, you know, a book like Ratification sort of details that what ended up happening doesn't have to happen. And I think that's one of the benefits of reading history in the Times or reading it in Slate or reading it in any sort of column is you kind of get more people to understand that not just individual choices, but large processes end up changing things in ways that you couldn't have predicted. And it sort of disassembles the myth that the long arc of like history like bends towards justice, which is, I think, it's the most dangerous myth that we sort of get in high school, at least in American high schools, because it's so hopeful. It's a beautiful myth, but it really is one of the most dangerous ones because it's this idea that there is sort of a happy ending. Sorry to end on, or not end, but sorry to end that on a sad note. But that sort of leads me to my next question is, you know, you've talked a lot about all the cool history books you've read and the fact that there's the university library near you. two questions under that. Is there any sort of starter books on the 19th century that you would sort of have everybody recommend besides Du Bois's Black Reconstruction? And then when you go to the university to research, are you looking at only secondary documents, or do you also try to, your hand at the archives?
Yeah, so it's funny. I never recommend Black Reconstruction to people as like a first thing. In part because
it's not
I think
a good first book.
It's not a good first book, and it's like if you want to just know about Reconstruction, it's actually not that helpful.
No, it's not. It's really good at getting passionate, but not about knowing what's happening.
And it's also like it's like a theoretical argument. That's like its value. No, so for 19th century U.S. history, I think like the book that can get people really hooked is What Hath God Wrought, Daniel Walker Howe's book in the Oxford History of the United States series. It's a terrific book. It spans the War of 1812 to 1844 or something. So really kind of like the second party system. It's like the beginning of the second party system to its dissolution. And I think it's a phenomenal book. But also, for me, I read it 11 years ago, 12 years ago, or something like that. For me, it kind of, I think one of the great things the books does is it really impresses upon you how contested everything about American society was at like every level. And that to me was just like so exciting to read. And so, on my like in my long-term, projects of like books to read, I have a big history of the Federalists, a big history of the Whig Party, right? Like kind of really diving into the history of the political parties and their coalitions is a kind of a direct outgrowth of having read that book a long time ago, sort of like taking the partisan politics and the political contestation of this period very seriously, both for its own right, but also just to kind of like have a better, fuller sense of how American politics has developed and what the conflicts have been over time. So that's like the starter book I would recommend. I think it's very.
Wait, just to confirm, that was What God Hath Wrought, right?
Yeah, What Hath God Wrought?
What Hath God Wrought? Yeah, Daniel Walker.
And then you can
Howe.
just follow that up with Battle Cry of Freedom, the next book in the series, which is also a terrific book. So like right there, and then Richard White's book on Reconstruction and the Gilded Age is also very good. So it's like 3 books right there that get you through the 19th century and are really great. Yeah, what was it? There's a second part to that question. I forgot it.
Oh, primary sources. I was wondering if you ever get to the archives.
Yeah. Not recently, but especially when I want to read about just like lawmaking and like legislative history. It's sort of like actually like reading, the Congressional Globe is what's called, reading that, which I can access from my house. If there's often there's like digital stuff. If I can get my hands on like someone's login to like look at the databases and like the digital stuff, then that I find very useful. Also a thing that happens is I'll read something and it'll be like a quote, right? It'll be I wrote something about the Anti-Federalists recently, and it was like I read the book, but someone was quoting an Anti-Federalist critic, and I feel uncomfortable just like quoting the book, and so I'll just like look for the actual source. Like I'll read the footnote, like what is this from, and then just like find where it's from, both so I can have it and also to read the full thing, because maybe there's something in the full thing that I like in the original document or the original source that hits me, and I want to like say, oh, this is interesting. Let's like work from there. So yeah.
Follow footnotes. Follow footnotes.
If we had another hour, I would give you my like down low on how to sort of organize all of your footnote hunting. I use Zotero and a mixture of other things, but it's really cool that you get to go to the primary documents. And I think it leads me to one of the last questions. It's by Adam Rothman, who's another historian who's in the audience. He sort of answered a little bit earlier, but what's the most like challenging aspect of writing a regular column for the Times? Is it just that it's difficult churning out the takes, or is it more that, are there other things that sort of make it difficult?
I mean, for me, I think it is just, it's not. That's a great deceptively different question. It's not like the pressure of writing that's just sort of like as I was saying to someone recently, you know, it's like making a widget at this point. It's like, it's like, it's my job. I'm in like the take factory and I just have to like, I just have to write. So it's not that. I mean, it's less, I personally feel this like very strong responsibility to use the column responsibly, to use the same word twice. I feel like, I feel bad when I don't think I've written something that really actually like teaches anyone anything. My genuine hope is that the readers of my column like at least learn, so they don't have to agree with me, but if they learn something new twice a week reading me, then I've done my job. And so I feel this obligation very strongly. And the hardest thing about writing the column is that I'm just like not sure what it is that week that I think is worth sharing, which is a sign to me that I gotta call people, I gotta do more reading, I gotta kind of get back into the research group of things. But that's because the writing isn't really all that hard anymore. The pace and structure, that's just like, again, I've been doing it for almost 5 years, so it's sort of, I've built up this rhythm. But it really is like the sense of responsibility I feel to readers to like not waste their time and to use the space responsibly, because it's like it's a massive platform. It's a huge platform in ways that I'm not even sure that most people really kind of recognize.
Okay, now I do have to ask one more question because I think
Yeah.
it leads into another audience question. You just talked about what a big responsibility it is to have this massive platform. And we've been dealing with, maybe I would say since 2015, a lot of confusing ways that the popular media, cable media, news, like journalism media, like newspaper media, deals with their platform and the type of journalism they do, not just columnists, right? Have you read any sort of like history of American media, and sort of like, has that sort of informed how you think about the role of, because the role of journalism and the role of being a journalist and the role of being a columnist and sort of a public thinker?
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I think has probably had the most impact on just the way I think about this is a great book called The Race Beat, about sort of the generation of like civil rights journalists, black civil rights journalists specifically, and sort of the kind of mission driven journalism they did. And kind of the tradition of African American journalism in general, being as it is sort of somewhat outside the mainstream and attuned to questions and concerns that are basically ignored in mainstream publications, is a real inspiration. That's not to say that I'm like some kind of crusader or anything, but just to say that the people, over many generations, Ida B. Wells, to the present, even before Ida B. Wells, right, saw themselves as having like not just a responsibility to the form or the papers they work for, the publication, the profession, but kind of a responsibility to sort of like egalitarian democracy itself, and trying to realize that. And that's it's too like grandiose to say that's how I think about my job, but like thinking of my responsibility as being towards this larger project of like egalitarianism and like equal citizenship and these sorts of things, and like how can I try to explain the world around us in ways that sort of like get people to think about these things and think about their world in these terms. That's sort of where I draw, I guess, like my inspiration from, kind of the tradition of African American journalism.
It seems like, unfortunately, we are kind of running out of time, but the thing that the word that's not being mentioned, but I think you're talking about, and again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, is about ethics. Is just dealing with the subjects, both ethically, both kind of temporary topics, but also kind of its relationship to the past, and showing that you can track down sources. These sources are available. Like, we can actually know something about this past. So when somebody makes a historical claim, this is what they're actually saying, right? And this is how it can inform our understanding of the of what's kind of going on today, whether it be the Supreme Court or gerrymandering that's going on in North Carolina, or any other kind of thing that's
or
kind of
education in Florida, for example, right? Like
happening.
the very Institution.
Just again, like pulling
history
ideas
teaching.
out of our head for no
Yeah.
reason whatsoever. Not that these things are going on. And history seems to be, and people, lots of other people have talked about, like history seems to be having a moment, like it's incredibly contested, right? About who's kind of controlling kind of narratives about the past, and that's why I think you see a lot of political pressures oftentimes about like the teaching of particular subjects and things of that nature. So your columns do incredible work, like you said, having a massive platform there, but doing it responsibly and ethically, I think and showing people that you can track down these sources too, like read these books, like learn more about these types of things and stuff like that. So
if nothing else, I really do try to like link to and like credit everything, and so readers themselves can like both make sure I'm not full of shit, but also to learn for themselves. Like I don't know, I'm married to a teacher, and educators are kind of like a big part of my life, and it's just sort of like and I read a lot of Dewey in college, and so I just have like this this sort of like idea of education as like a tool for democracy in my head, and that really informs like how I think about what I do.
Yep.
That's
that shit
really
matters.
cool.
So yeah. And what a better way to close. So
what a better way to close.
Yeah. So thank you again, Jamelle, for joining us on Historians. This has been a really wonderful and interesting conversation. Jamelle, who writes for the New York Times, you can find his columns kind of everywhere on whatever social media platform happens to be the next thing. We don't know anymore, right?
We don't know.
Yeah, who knows, right?
Yeah,
it's whatever. Anyway, so thank you everyone else for joining us. We have another show in 2 weeks from now. We'll actually be talking with a bunch of the mods from the Reddit Ask Historian subreddit, which if you don't know about, you will learn all about. It should be really a fascinating conversation about public outreach in history. But until then, thank you everyone. Have a great evening. Have a great weekend, and cheers.
Cheers. Thanks so much.
Thank you.